What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some more information about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 via a recent hands-on preview that Game Informer had that they sat down to talk about during one of their podcasts, as I believe it'll be like a feature on one of their upcoming magazines. But they were invited out, played the game, talked about it, and from that conversation we actually have some interesting details about the game, and I am admittedly a little bit behind on this. This happened like 3 or so days ago, but I've been getting my son ready for back to school, so I've been a little busy myself. With all of that said though, just so you're aware, I will link a video where they are talking about this down below. They talk about a few different games in that, but it's the first one they mentioned there. And what's more, in their own words, they were told pretty much up front that they weren't going to be able to ask about things like what happened with Hardsuit Labs, etc. Not really much of a surprise there, given how very tight-lipped everybody has been about it, and at this point, given that we have like no information, I assume some sort of legal NDA is involved. But ultimately, what the people from Game Informer got to play was the Chinese Room's almost finished version of this game, which is actually, in addition to a couple of other of these hands-on previews we've seen, a few more traditional media companies having spoken about. And I think that's important specifically because that means that they are talking about the most relevant version of this game, as unsurprisingly, because of all of the marketing and everything for the original Hardsuit Labs version that happened that you can still find. A lot of people are understandably a little bit confused if you haven't been following this entire saga, and I personally am not going to recap that here. I have mentioned it many times in previous videos. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 is an entire playlist on this channel if you'd like to get caught up, but what I'm going to do here in this video is talk about the details from what they've talked about that are actually new, so I can sort of relay them and amplify that a little bit, and then I'm going to give some opinions of mine at the end. So a good deal of what they talked about first was actually the setting of Seattle. So the reason they were talking about this to begin with is that when the Chinese Room received the work that Hardsuit Labs had done thus far, they were apparently given the option to use it, start from scratch, etc., and it seems to be a bit of a mixed approach. Like, for instance, they used a lot of things like the models and stuff that have already been made, but then altered those characters in some way so it is different, obviously. But one of the things that they did reuse is, of course, the setting of Seattle. And at the very least, in this particular version, it is going to be set specifically around Christmas time. So that, for this purpose, is going to be used as a bit of a juxtaposition between, the jovial holiday spirit of the human world against the backdrop, of course, of our role as a vampire getting into the dark and unseen bits. Now, this means a few things for the setting itself. Because it's nighttime, a lot of, obviously, the more walked areas for civilians are going to be really brightly lit. The shine of Christmas lights and, almost a neon-esque effect is going to be in effect there. And while it is obviously going to be during the nighttime, so you wouldn't exactly expect bustling streets, there will be enough people walking around, and from this preview they did actually mention that it did seem pretty alive for the most part. What's more, Seattle is apparently at least one big explorable map. They didn't obviously say it was open world size or anything, but they were confined to a large enough zone to run around in. I did not get any information if there would be multiple of these via a hub system or if it was just the one, but that's kind of what you're working with there. And unsurprisingly, light and dark plays into the building of Seattle a great deal. They wanted both the actual alive portions, like the city streets, versus the alleys and things, to feel like separate worlds. And so, in places that are not obviously civilian areas, you can make bigger use of your powers and are less likely to result in a masquerade violation. But they did actually also talk about the masquerade violations themselves. If you are actively breaking the masquerade, you will be ambushed by other vampires there to put a stop to it, which is apparently instantaneous. You'll basically be snuck up on, staked, paralyzed, and I assume that's something akin to a game over. Which is really all it has to be, but it's important to make that distinction because apparently there's also going to be things like vampire hunters, and I wouldn't be surprised, but it's not confirmed yet, that the Second Inquisition may very well be in there as well. But, be aware that there's a difference between those two things, ultimately. They did talk a bit about traversal as well, in the context of that situation where, you'll be able to run across rooftops, do things like that, scale buildings. You can walk normal speed for in front of humans, but it's also possible to activate things like celerity, and that will actually give you increased physics to move farther, which is an interesting thing. And I'm curious to see how much that will actually play around and how busted you can make that, basically. Nonetheless, a few other things I want to mention here. For starters, there's been a lot of, I think, very appropriate reactions to Fire's name, because the name Fire is very cringy. I think we can all agree on that for the most part, but what I thought was especially strange was that apparently our character, Fire, who we are playing as, just picks this name from a poster after waking up from their torpor, because we play as an elder vampire that's like roughly 400 years old, and this is apparently just a name they saw on a poster, so that's the alias they've chosen this time. That's important because in the vampire world, we do play a sort of set character known as the Nomad, but what is supposed to happen is that we are supposed to be able to kind of decide who the Nomad is in terms of clan and whatnot, which makes this decision even stranger to me, because you already have this established vague enough background to establish the character in the world. Why do I need to have a forced name? Like, why didn't you just let the player name? It just seems like an unnecessary restriction, I guess. And I'll circle back to that here in a moment. Apparently, from this hands-on, the people who played it did say that the story does seem particularly interesting. If you don't know already, Fire wakes up, has all these sigils and things on his or her skin. You can play as either or. And that's at the heart of the mystery that sees another character in your head known as Fabian, and I'm a little frankly worried about that specifically because I think, as many games have shown, that has the potential to be very annoying if the player doesn't have control over it, but I've talked about that previously as well. Now, what I thought was interesting there, though, is that the people who have played it do seem to enjoy the story well enough for what it is. But, again, without having played it personally, that's a hard thing to really comment on. What I did think was kind of funny is that they were talking about how the story was good because it's a more narratively focused game, and while there are things like combat, and they got into combat, which we are about to, it did seem like combat felt very secondary to them, or at least that's what I got out of it. Like, it worked, it was fun enough for what it was, but it wasn't exactly the star of the show, which makes sense, I suppose. Now, they then went on to talk a fair bit about specifics here, so there's 4 playable clans: Bruja, Tremere, Ventru, and the Banu Hakim, who each have their own slightly distinct versions of things. Everything from animations to passives they get from the way they engage in combat, like Banu Hakim's has a passive that triggers when they make a stealth attack that gives them increased movement in stealth that lasts for a quick period, which allows them to just very, very quickly take out a bunch of enemies, and just little things like that. But the other thing they talked about was how some of this worked on a clan-by-clan basis. Now, some of this we knew a little bit of already, but the gist of it is that your clan, the one of the 4 you choose, is going to be able to pick their skills from their tree without having to do anything extra, whereas you will eventually be able to pick abilities from the other 3 clans you did not choose, but that's going to require more work. Things like finding a mentor and then actually getting specific blood resonances from the people you feed on in order to unlock those things. But that brings up a pretty important point as well, which is the difference between feeding in combat and feeding in what they call social situations. So feeding in combat is basically necessary to fill your powers up. So you'll feed, get blood points, spend those on attacking and using your actual abilities. Simple enough, makes sense. Outside, in social feeding situations, that's a bit different. So your goal here is to actually arouse the resonance in a character if you're not just hungry. This goes back to their blood resonance system, and basically your goal is to get the person that you are about to feed on worked up in whatever way is relevant to that person. Doing this will reward you with the blood resonance that you need to then unlock potentially further abilities. Now, what they didn't talk about that I'm curious about is the consequences of not feeding. Like, obviously there's the combat stuff, but I'm very curious to find out if the beast comes up at all, again, the consequences for not feeding. Because the last sort of new detail before I start talking about opinions has me a little bit concerned. So what they mentioned is that there's apparently been a decent enough push to make a lot of the people you feed on kind of jerks. That is to say, like, the NPCs walking around being like either rude or just generally not good people, and that is apparently in order to make the player feel not bad for feeding on them, which I thought was an interesting thing to say. Because at the core of the World of Darkness, like, the point is you are the monster. You are supposed to be the bad guy at the end of it. And, maybe to quote Wreck-It Ralph, just because you're the bad guy doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a bad guy, but you will never exactly be some paragon of justice here. And I think, at the very least, this is an interesting thing to balance overall, because it feels like, to me at least, that I'd probably want a good mix, like that being, there are clearly situations where I think it should embrace the fact that you are a vampire, which is a monstrous entity doing bad things. And so just trying to make you, the player, feel better for feeding on bad people is just a weird thing to say, I guess. But at the same time, there's also like the flip side of it, power fantasy, where you want to sort of revel in that monstrosity, and in that case, feeding on somebody who's a jerk is perfectly fine. So I suppose what I'm saying, for me at least, is that it really depends on how that plays in practice, but it is admittedly a little odd, I guess I will say. But a few other things. So I talked about, apparently, our character getting their name Fire from a poster, which is, again, just really odd to me, because that feels like the kind of thing you should have left up to the player. It's fine that they want the character here, the Nomad, to be like a set entity in the sense that it's going to allow them to tell the story that they want to tell in the case of this elder vampire. With all of these other options, like picking things like the clan, male or female, all that stuff, it's just very strange to me to then, for whatever reason, when it comes to actually naming this character with their fake alias name anyway, that's where they're like, this is what it is. Because I gotta be honest, like many people, I've never cared for that name to begin with, but to then even add on to that by being like, oh, it comes from a poster you read when you woke up from torpor is just odd, just all the way around. I don't agree with that decision at all. But, we'll see how it pans out, I suppose. The other big thing I wanted to mention here towards the end, really, is that they've talked a great deal, just from various previews and past things they've said in developer updates about the way, combat and the animations and stuff will work. And that's fine, honestly. I don't have a problem with anything that they've shown off here, really, other than the animations looking a little odd in places, which, given the overall scope of the game, is not a terribly surprising thing. And that's mostly in regards to, your character feeding on other characters in combat that are supposed to be, quick little moments anyway. So it's not the most offensive thing I've ever seen, But my point is that they tend to be focusing a lot on that stuff specifically, and not necessarily the choices and the consequences of it. And I think the closest they've gotten to that is discussing their dialogue system, in which, characters memorize and react accordingly to how you have behaved in the past. And they showed examples where the way another vampire or kindred will react to you from the same dialogue option will change based on how you've spoken to them previously. And in a strange way, that is a system that they've talked about that almost kind of reminds me of something like Alpha Protocol. It had a slightly more rudimentary version of essentially that same concept, which I thought was a really interesting thing. And yet, outside of that dialogue system, I haven't heard anything else about the choices and consequences of this game. And I understand they don't necessarily want to do spoilers and stuff, but so far it really feels like all of the choices that they've shown off that you can make seem to primarily have combat and gameplay repercussions. But what does that do in terms of the replayability of the game? Especially because they are using the name Bloodlines at the end of the day, and that is going to come with certain expectations, whether people like that or not. And one really big thing about Bloodlines 1 is that the clan you played had a pretty significant impact on the story, and also gameplay. The Malkavians is really well known. The Nosferatu had to stick to the sewers because of their appearance, things like that. The Tremere got a whole bunch of extra stuff as well. And my point being that there were serious repercussions for this choice. And yet here, the biggest thing they've mentioned so far is that it changes how you get skills and how you approach combat. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I enjoy having this information as well and enjoying how the city works and everything. But what I'm not seeing is big amounts of choice and consequence that see this playing out different ways. It may very well be in there, mind you. It may just be something they want to hold off on until they get closer to the release, or until the game releases itself, which they are still aiming for October. So ultimately, we shall simply have to wait and see, but it is something that I have noticed. And from everything I've seen here and everything they've talked about previously, I'm starting to get the very distinct impression that what is probably going to happen here is that the game will be perfectly good all on its own, but as a sequel to Bloodlines, it's probably not going to live up to the sort of mythologized take. And that does sort of then beg the question of if anything about this game is truly related to that first one. And I guess that's one thing at least that I'm really interested in seeing about this game ultimately is how, if at all, it connects to the previous one, as I think in an interview they even mentioned it being almost more of a spiritual successor. And I think all of that together, combined with all of the development stuff, is going to make for a messy experience, probably for everybody involved. But as always, I choose to be cautiously optimistic about this one. I think there's a ton of potential for this to go sideways, obviously. I'm hoping it turns out well. I really like the World of Darkness. I would love to see it do well. But I think just about everybody is maintaining a healthy amount of skepticism here. But regardless of how it pans out, I will, as always, continue to update people on it until I eventually get my hands on it and can review it for myself so I can finally put a close to this very interesting journey. But that's pretty much going to do it for today at least. Hope you enjoyed this look at some of these new details, or at the very least listening to them, I suppose. So if you're interested in keeping up with all that, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this stuff down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.